Today we're going to go and review Madden NFL 2008 for the Nintendo Gamecube, which was, in the US, the very last Gamecube game ever released. And just like last year when we reviewed Madden 09 on the Xbox, we're also going to take a look at the Xbox 360 version of the same game. But first, let's take a look at the GameCube itself, and also why I have this Wii out here. Probably the very last video game console with a handle built right in. So this here is the GameCube system itself. As you can see, it is very small. It's so small you can't even use full-sized game discs on it. Like literally, here's a PlayStation 2 game. It literally will not fit. So obviously GameCube games do not come on regulation DVDs. But before we talk about the games themselves, let's take a look at the system itself. As you can see, it's very small. I know I just said that. It's almost literally half the size of the original Xbox, which was one of its primary competitors. Other primary competitor being the PS2, which ran away with the market, but that's beside the point. So, while it is really small, it is pretty powerful for a 6th generation console. It has it's slightly less powerful than the original Xbox, but it is more powerful than the PlayStation 2. So that's a pretty good little machine, and it's very portable. It's so I still can't believe they put a handle on it. It's got 4 controller ports here. Choose a. This is the last generation to really use proprietary controller ports. So this is off the Waveboard, which I'm going to show in a second. 2 memory cards. This has, obviously, as you can tell from how small it is, doesn't have any onboard storage, unlike the Xbox or the fat PS2. If you added the hard drive to it, no onboard storage, so you got to use memory cards. Memory cards are about this big. They measured space in blocks because that was the thing. Really, I think this actually might be the last one that really measured it in blocks as opposed to megabytes. But still, since you were using it just really for game saves, you could put a fair amount of game saves on here. As long as you were doing like sports games that took up a monstrous amount. Now, there were some interesting accessories for the GameCube. As I showed first, the Wavebird controller, which is the first party video game controller that used that didn't use infrared, that was actually released. Now, infrared is basically like what you have on your TV remote, where you have to have a line of sight directly to your television or your console in this case. So that means that you literally had to have your controller pointing at the game system at all times, and the game system couldn't be like behind something else. Also, infrared had a little bit of lag and wasn't quite as reliable. This used, I believe, a 2.4 gigahertz radio frequency, which only one other console before this used a radio frequency for controllers. I think it was called either Atari 27800 or 2800. It was never released, partially because its controllers produce so much interference, but that's really beside the point. There's like a few dozen prototypes out there. You can probably find if you look on YouTube. But back to the Wavebird, had a pretty substantial range. I've really never had a problem with the distance of it. Came with this dongle which plugged right into your controller port. It was molded so it fit snug right in there. And you could have multiple Wavebirds plugged in at the same time because each one had a separate channel. There were 8 different channels, and if you were really worried about interference, you could have one person on like 1 and one person on 4 to keep interference away, or do like 1, 3, 5, 7 or something like that. So basically you just turn this dial to whichever number you want, which I'm on 6. Then there's this dial down here, which you turn it to the same number. It works really well. The only downside is that this does not have rumble. The official controller does have a rumble support, but still a really great controller if you can find one. Another official Nintendo product was the Game Boy Player. This one was $15. Now this plugged straight into the bottom of your system, and you basically just left it on forever. And you could play Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance games with it. If you needed to capture footage for something, this was a great option for you because it let you easily capture your Game Boy footage. Now, before I put it in and show it, I'm going to show you these other 2 ports. Okay, this is serial port 3, which is where the Game Boy Player here goes. Serial port 1 is where the network cards were. Nintendo came out with a 56K and a broadband modem adapters. Neither one of them was really widely used. I think in the US we only got Phantasy Star Online version 1 and 2, and then version 3 because 1 and 2 were in a thing together, on the same disc. And there were a handful of games that supported LAN. I want to say Mario Kart Double Dash was one, and Kirby's Air Ride, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm pretty sure there were other ones. Those are the 2 that come to mind. And I don't think Serial Port 2 was ever actually used. So, to put it on, you just put it down here, take your GameCube and slide it right in, and it squeezes in, and then it's got these 2 screws here. You take a screwdriver or a quarter or whatever you have, and screw them in. Don't screw them in too tight, but yeah. And now you're good. Now the only problem with this is a lot of times you will find the unit itself loose, and by loose I mean not only not connected to a GameCube, but without the necessary boot disk, which you need to play your Game Boy games. I have it. It's in a case that's similar to a Japanese game as opposed to an American game, but I don't have it with me at the moment. Okay, one final accessory I want to show off is the monitor. You may be saying, Sean, a lot of consoles have monitors. Well, since the GameCube was so small, it was really pretty well suited for a monitor type system. So this one's by Interact. Pretty sure there were other ones, but this is just the one I have. And you slide it on, you snap it on there. I usually just keep it straight on because you can use this. You can have this on without using it. Basically, it just plugs right in the back in the analog slot. Takes its own power. There's also another cable that'll like use the same power adapter, but that's beside the point, and it works. And one other thing, since we're back here, there's three ports back here. Just ignore the Game Boy player and the monitor. There's your power supply, which uses an external power brick. The analog audiovisual out. This actually uses the same cables as the Super Nintendo Junior, and the Nintendo 64. So this is actually a interesting little tidbit. This is for both the composite and the RF, if you still need that. Fun little story. Christmas of like 2000 or 2001, I got a. Actually, it had to have been 2001 because it was after the Gamecube was released. I got a Nintendo 64 for Christmas, and we didn't realize that it only had composite and our TV was RF only. So the day after Christmas, we actually went and bought a Nintendo Gamecube RF adapter because it said it works with the N64. But that's really beside the point. And also you have a digital AV out. Now, not every GameCube USB has this. There's a later revision which just takes this out. Because Nintendo really, this was used for their component cables. And Nintendo really did not push the component very much. Even though a lot of games really do work in 480p and can play in the 480p so that they look better. The AV cables in the US, I believe, were only released online, and for some reason their component cables only had the video, so you still needed the audio from the AV output, and the board or like the cable itself had this special chip on it, which is why, as opposed to like this cable, which you've seen hundreds of clones of, and you could go into like any retro game type store and they have a bunch of them brand new from like Retrobit or something like the Genesis or the like PS2 and Xbox both have relatively inexpensive component and composite cables you can find brand new. This one hasn't been remade yet, so if you want to find one of these to play your GameCube games in 480p, it is going to cost you multiple times what the system itself will cost you. You can usually get a GameCube, depending on where you find it, in what condition, and included stuff. You can probably find them for about $30. That's how much I paid for. I think it was this one. And I've found a couple at thrift shops since then. So you can find a GameCube for relatively cheap. The component cables, on the other hand, will run well over $100. So I did record the NFL 08, or the Madden 08 in component, but I didn't use the GameCube. I used instead the Nintendo Wii. This is Nintendo's 7th generation console. Came out in about, it was 2000. Yeah, it came out in 2006. And mini units, especially all the earlier units, have full Nintendo GameCube backwards compatibility. They have a controller ports here and memory card slots. So you could literally just plug in the Wavebird and the memory card, and you are good to go for playing most everything on the GameCube. The only thing you really can't do is the is a few of the internet games, because I don't think the internet games work. And you also can't use the Game Boy player. Mostly because there's no port for it. There's no serial port on here. Actually, this really didn't have any ports, except for just a couple USBs. But component cables for the Wii are very cheap. You can get them brand new for less than like 10 or 20 bucks. And they also will work on the Wii U, as a matter of fact. Nintendo really seems to like using AV cables that will work on multiple generations of console. As a matter of fact, I think the only one that doesn't work is the digital AV out from the Gamecube. It's a different port, and it won't. The cable for the Wii will not fit on it. But while there are some, I've seen some people who have really gone in deep with this. There are some differences between how the 480p looks on the GameCube as opposed to how it looks on the Wii with the respective component cables. Unless you're a real purist, this is probably the best way to play GameCube games. If you want to play them in high definition. If you want the actual GameCube itself, they're pretty cheap because most of these are backwards compatible, which is why a lot of GameCubes are pretty plentiful nowadays. Kind of like the same thing with the PlayStation 1. But if you are looking for this, you have to make sure you get one that has the easiest way is to tell is that the Wii is like vertical, as if it wants to be stood up. If it's like this, then it won't have the ports on the side. But if you can look on the side and see if there's ports here, that's how you will know if it will play GameCube games or not. Now, on to the games themselves, because we've talked way too much about hardware. GameCube games came on mini-style discs. They're about this big. In comparison to, I'll use that same PlayStation disc again. In comparison to here's this PlayStation magazine disc, they're a lot smaller. They have less storage space. I believe these have, I want to say 1.4 gigabytes of space. I might be wrong. Editing Sean will tell me if I'm wrong. This is for use only in the USA, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America. But as opposed to because the Xbox and the PS2 both used actual DVDs. And the actual DVDs have about 4.7 gigabytes of space on them. On each one. I don't think they had any dual layer ones, but I may be wrong about that too. So there were a litany of really great games that came out. And this is just ones out of my collection that I personally have. And for some reason I cannot find my actual copy of Super Smash Bros. Melee, which may be the best game on the system. But let's take a look at the games that I do have my cartridge or my cases available for. Starting with Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, a sequel to Rogue Squadron on the N64, I should say. And it is a really good flight simulator, or not really flight simulator, but a space combat type game in the Star Wars universe. Obviously, you play as, I don't think actually your character has a name now that I think about it. Well, regardless, that's unimportant. And yeah. Next up, we're going to take a look at Animal Crossing, which is a fun little life simulation style game where basically you play as a villager and you go around throughout town doing various little tasks. Spawned a very popular series. Actually, there was a version of this that came out on the N64, but it was only released in Japan. This one is the one that the West got, and I think it's probably it's a better version. Now the next 4 games are all kind of in a common type thread. First, we're going to take a look at The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. Now, this was an era where Nintendo was willing to go out and take risks with their established properties. By that I mean, with Wind Waker here, this game was in a cel-shaded art style, as opposed to the more realistic style that you got out of Ocarina of Time, as realistic as the N64 could get. It pissed off a lot of people before the game was released. I mean, it's kind of hard to find now because the game was very well regarded, because it's a very good game. But a lot of people were very upset with just the art style of the game. Now, this game was also re-released on the Wii U in 2015, I believe. That's a good HD port, but really, this game itself holds up very well. So this game is relatively easy to find for a GameCube Zelda game. For a GameCube game and for a Zelda game, I should say. It's pretty easy to find. You can probably pick it up relatively cheap. So I definitely consider that one. Next up is Metroid Prime, which, again, this is a really radical departure from the original Metroid games that came out on the NES and the Super NES, and even the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. This one takes it, instead of a 2D side-scrolling adventure game, you play a 3D first-person adventure. And it was also pretty well received. And it spawned its own little franchise, which I think they're coming out with another Metroid Prime game. It's like Federation Force, but it's not actually going to have Samus, so is it really Metroid? I don't know. But that's beside the point. Next up, Mario Kart Double Dash. This was obviously the Mario Kart game for the GameCube. Every Nintendo system has one. This is the GameCube's. What's different about this one compared to a lot of the other ones is this one, you have 2 players, or 2 characters on each kart. One that does the driving and one that's the gunner, basically, that throws the objects and does stuff like that. This was the only time when they did that. Mario Kart Wii went back to the more traditional gameplay style of the original games, but it's a pretty good game. This one does support the LAN adapter if you have it, or the broadband adapter for LAN. And last up with this theme, Super Mario Sunshine. Again, it's a Mario platforming game, but instead of pure platforming, it has a really heavy emphasis on this flood unit for cleaning up paint gunk or graffiti, and for jumping and like hovering. It was all 4 of these games were relatively divisive upon their like pre-release, but most have gone on to be pretty well regarded games. So last up, we're going into Soul Calibur 2, which is a fighting game by Namco. This is not a Nintendo game at all. But what's interesting about this one is that this is the best version of Soul Calibur 2. Soul Calibur 2 came out on the Xbox, the PS2, and the GameCube. All 3 of the major systems of the time. The major difference between them, except beside the fact that the PS2's was really weak, because the PS2 was a pretty weak console, is that each one had a special guest character that was exclusive to that version of the game. The Xbox had Spawn, from the Todd McFarlane comics, which was pretty awesome, I'm not going to lie. Probably definitely the second best one. I have that version of the game. I've had it for a long time, because Spawn is badass. The PS2 version has Hayachi from the Tekken games. And first off, Hayachi has a slight disadvantage of the fact that he doesn't have any weapons, because Tekken games aren't weapons based, whereas Soul Calibur is. And also, if you wanted to play a fighting game with Hayachi in it, I could just play Soul Calibur, or I could just play Tekken. I think 4 and 5, I think were both. Yeah, 4 and 5 were out on the PS2. 4, I think, was already out by this time, and I think 5 was on its way. So that's kind of silly. The GameCube, on the other hand, because Nintendo was working with Namco, and I believe Sega as well, on the Triforce board, which is sort of based on the GameCube architecture, but not really. An arcade machine. And either in one of those contracts in there, or just because of the goodwill the two companies had, Nintendo allowed Namco to use Link from The Legend of Zelda in Soul Calibur 2, but only in the GameCube version, obviously. Which is freaking awesome. So that makes this legitimately the best version of the game, because it's just really good. And you can play as freaking Link. And it looks almost as good as the Xbox version. Those are some games, just some of the games out of my collection. So, with all that, the GameCube was not really that successful at in sales. It came in third place in the 6th generation with 30 million units, which is more than the Dreamcast's 10 million, sure, but less than the, I believe, 33 to 35 million Xboxes sold and the 150 million PlayStation 2s. And as a frame of reference, the Super Nintendo sold 45 million units in a much smaller video game market 10 years prior to the release of the GameCube. So Nintendo went back to the drawing board and came out with the Wii, which I showed you earlier. But the GameCube still has a pretty good place in a lot of hearts, because a lot of those games are really great and you can only get them on this system. But let's take a look at Madden 08, which admittedly you can get on other systems. And let's see how it is. Okay. Let's be honest with ourselves. Madden is a known quantity at this point. It comes out every year in August, just like clockwork, each year with incremental changes over the last year. You can't really notice them from year to year, but 5 or 10 years apart, you'll see the big differences. You play as one of the NFL teams from that season and compete against others, either the CPU or a friend. And over the past 12 years, they've added online play, but the servers for Madden NFL 08 are down for the 360, and there never were any for the GameCube. The graphics and sound are just about what you would expect from a 2007 Xbox 360 game. But that's not the main focus in this video. The GameCube version looks acceptable, even if it is probably a straight port of the PS2 version and not an upgrade from when EA cared about the GameCube, which for Madden may never have actually been a time. Their graphics look a little muddy, I'm not going to lie, and not just the mud. The sound's good, with commentary from John Madden and Al Michaels. This is when John Madden was still doing Madden. There's less music, but I can't let you hear it anyway. And that's just kind of eh. The Xbox 360 version does allow you to have custom soundtracks, but the GameCube doesn't have a hard drive. Now, both games have the same gameplay elements, obviously. But the layout of the GameCube controller, with 3 different face button sizes and 2 that are the same shape and color, makes some things a little more challenging. The Xbox 360 doesn't have this problem, with its face buttons uniformly shaped and differently colored. So when you're looking at a receiver, just look for the color and press the button. One thing that really is noticeable about the GameCube version is the load times. Not before you play a game, because that would be pretty understandable and all. But whenever the game decides to switch cameras between plays, there's a noticeable break where it stops for at least half a second. Just to show the coach on the sidelines gesturing or something. If you can't seamlessly go to them, there really isn't any added value for them, and it's kind of annoying, honestly. One other major difference is content. The GameCube version uses Madden cards, which were a big thing in the 6th generation for the franchise. The 360 version doesn't have them, but it does have a trophy room, which is kind of a less fun version of NFL 2K5's My Crib area. Which is a game that's 3 years older than that one, and on a different console. The GameCube has more creation options, but the franchise mode is less in-depth than even Madden NFL 2005. It's kind of bare, which is odd since earlier games in the franchise for the same generation of consoles had more. The 360 has a much more legitimate franchise mode and a superstar career mode, where you play as a player throughout their career. Those are the major differences and deficiencies of the GameCube version compared to the next-gen one. Let's go back for some final thoughts. So, that's Madden NFL 08. It's kind of a little disappointing, honestly. I was expecting a little bit more closer to the 09 effort on the original Xbox that we showed last year, as opposed to what we got. The really frequent load times, and the graphics are as good as you would expect for a GameCube game, sure, but the load times, the lack of options and features really makes it kind of a not great effort from EA for the last hurrah. Which is why the GameCube version gets a 6 out of 10 from Last Call Games. If you desperately want to play a game with Vince Young on the cover, I forgot who it was for a second, then, well, this is pretty much your only option, because let's be honest here. But otherwise, I would probably suggest getting something else. Madden 05, or 2005 actually, before they did the O's. Madden 2005 is a really good, fun game, and it has much better franchise options than you even get here, which is stupidly obscene. So that's it. And oh yeah, here's the Xbox score right there. There's the 360 score, not the original Xbox score. I have that one on me. So stay tuned for next time on Last Call Games, and we'll see you then. Hello and welcome to the very first Last Call Games podcast, which is also a Let's Play. A Let's Cast, if you will.